Fast fashion production. Fast fashion garment production copies luxury couture brands and uses low-quality materials in order to bring inexpensive styles to the end consumer and encourage repurchasing. Hey there! Are you interested in fashion too? Well, we live in the time of fast fashion, and to say it's fast is a bit of an understatement. But do you know how garment production actually started? One thing is for sure, it's changed a lot since its beginning. Of course, civilization developed step by step and processes needed to be adapted accordingly. However, the whole fashion industry graduated into overproduction, meaning that too many and lower quality products started coming out of the factories making clothing. Can you name any negative impacts of the acceleration? If you're about to say vast amounts of waste and harmful effects on the environment, you're right, but this is just scratching the surface. So, please stay tuned if you want to know what I mean. In the early days of humankind, people wore clothes only to protect themselves or signal their origin and identity. Let's think back to what cavemen wore as an example. We can also look at all ethnological backgrounds, including the different customs and culture we all have. For a long time, every piece was hand-sewn, but as garment making evolved and became an industry, it influenced the kind of wardrobe we own nowadays. Accessibility to clothing also changed. We can now get a new outfit from hundreds of shops, even with the option to have it delivered to our front door. But buying clothes wasn't always that easy as it is now. For many people, it was a privilege, and it was very expensive to dress well and fashionably. Tailors made good money if they were skilled, but less wealthy people wanted the opportunity too, and with the help of the Industrial Revolution, their dream came true. Let's step back in time to understand industrialization more. Richard Arkwright was using other people's ideas and improving them. Some examples are the spinning jenny, which made yarn by twisting the fibers, and the carding machine, which aligned the fibers, preparing them for spinning. In 1771, he opened the world's first water-powered textile mill in Cromford, UK, using these advanced machines. This started the Industrial Revolution, which changed production from handmade to machine-made, the system we still rely on today. Workers lived in the 5-story factory building, where shifts were 13 hours long, with only 2 short breaks. He started with 200 workers. A decade later, there were 1,000. By 1778, wool production disappeared, and by 1790, Arkwright had almost 200 mills throughout the country, and Manchester had become the Cottonopolis. In 1810, tables turned for Arkwright, when the businessman Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to Europe to copy his idea. 3 years later, the Boston Manufacturing Company in the USA was established, which used raw material that was sourced from slave work. As early as the 1830s, overproduction started and introduced a slow decline of the textile industry. Due to the highly efficient textile production, its value dropped, and factory owners paid less to the workers, who reacted with unrest, protests, and strikes. The factories started employing immigrants, who were mostly refugees, so they accepted all kinds of working conditions, from longer working hours to unhealthy and unsafe working environments to underpayment. Even their children started working in the same factories to help families make ends meet. Worker strikes were responded to with aggression and violence by mill owners. As a result of corporate greed, factories became a dehumanizing and exploitative workplace. At the same time, in the 1830s, the invention of the lock-stitch machine sped up the production of ready-made garments. In 1861, when the Civil War began in the United States, bigger demand grew quickly. Standard-size ready-to-wear uniforms were needed in large quantities. After the war, people realized that having their own size readily available was convenient, so the demand in producing menswear and later women's wear became high, resulting in the American apparel industry. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania were the producing centers for these clothes and undergarments, and later for fashion items. Similarly to Britain's Manchester, other places also had large factories that characterized them, like cities along the Rhine in Germany, and famously Łódź, a city of the Industrial Revolution in Poland. Sometime later, New York became the capital of fashion, where high-quality garments were made from European wool and silk and by the hands of numerous Jewish immigrants from Hungary, Russia, and Poland who were skilled in sewing. They copied the couture fashion seen in Paris. An unfortunate event happened in March 1911 in New York City. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Company burned down, resulting in the death of 146 workers. Most of the victims died because safety features were neglected in the factory. After this, a series of laws and regulations were developed to better protect workers' safety. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the largest workers' union in the United States with primarily female workers, founded in 1900, also stepped up and played a major role in labor history in the 1920s and 1930s. Meanwhile, business was growing, so in 1931, Manhattan had more factories than any cities in the world. With the breakout of the First World War, uniforms were needed again. Then, the Second World War increased the production even further. The garment district in New York alone had 200,000 women's wear workers, and they produced 66% of US clothing, hence the name Fashionopolis. In the 50s, people from Manhattan were migrating to the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Rochester, and Chicago, the domestic version of offshoring. It's a long story, isn't it? And it still goes on. But I would like you to pay special attention from now on, because it is related to you too, more and more. We are arriving at the times when your parents and grandparents were living their youth, and when you yourself were born. So these happenings affect your life as well. In the 1960s, young people wanted cheap clothing to follow the new trends and reject the traditions of older generations. Fashion brands had to find ways to keep up with this increasing demand. Massive textile mills were opening across the developing world, resulting in savings for European and US companies by outsourcing their labor. Throughout the decades of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and in the 2010s, the making of garments became even faster. While a 3-week production time was considered a radical change in the 90s by fast fashion brands, at the turn of the century, 1 week was enough to finish up new styles. And with this, ultra-fast fashion emerged from online-only brands. However, nowadays we have arrived at real-time retail, which gives stores new merchandise in 3 days. They also make clothes for insanely cheap prices. It also migrates from cheap workforce to even cheaper, moving from country to country, like from China to India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Turkey. These countries do not have the modern manufacturing infrastructure of China, but they are cheaper for production. From the 2000s, China, India, Bangladesh, and also Sri Lanka started outsourcing production to Africa. They are now the middleman in the fashion business line. They have found countries where tax and wages are low, and they moved their production to these countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. Since 2014, Ethiopia has opened 4 industrial parks and had plans for 8 more. China is making Ethiopia a giant fast fashion factory. We've recently had to live through a worldwide crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has left a huge impact on the fashion industry. Retail shops had to close and online sales were slow, since the global economy was in decline. But it was the garment workers that were mostly hit by it. More than $40 billion worth of goods from factories and suppliers were cancelled by brands. As a result, they had difficulties paying for materials and for their workers' salaries. Fast fashion could actually be so cheap because workers didn't get their due salary for it. So much so that they were paid far below the living wage. The global pandemic just worsened the situation because workers were denied about 5 months' worth of money. During the coronavirus crisis, it became clear how the fashion system relies on exploitation among the developing countries, and how brands do not have the intention of showing any solidarity and partnership to suppliers and their own workforce. Some brands did pay what they were due eventually, though only after public pressure was put on them by the Fashion Revolution community and clean clothes campaigns #PayUp. But some refused to pay even after this. Only in Bangladesh, more than 1,000 factories were impacted by order cancellations. With wages barely enough for living, these workers had no savings to deal with such a crisis. Their lives became endangered as they were unable to pay for bills, rent, and food. It is always those that are at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the end of the supply chain, that feel the consequences of an irresponsible action. Task. Until now, you've been listening to the history of fast fashion production. But how about getting a little bit more involved? Imagine you are a textile or garment worker in 1790 in the UK, in 1911 in the USA, in 2020 in Ethiopia. Write a short list for each of the roles, what the needs of these workers could be. You may consider a time when you were working at home helping your parents, for example. What were the circumstances? Then compare them. Are the needs of these workers throughout history different? These questions might help you imagine the situation. How do you imagine a normal working day? Have you ever worked at home? Do you think a garment worker has the same rights as you? Do they have the right for clean water and proper nutrition? How many hours do they have to work and in what conditions? Can they take breaks? What do you think a factory should provide the workers in order to make sure that the workplace is safe for everyone? You can write about working hours, over hours, taking breaks, wages, health and safety conditions, and so on. Pause the video and do the task. Reflection. In this lesson, we discovered the birth of the textile industry and also the history of fast fashion. Now we understand the impact of fast fashion not only on our environment, but also on those people who work in these factories. The exploitation of workers is not a new problem. If we count everything in, it has been going on for about 190 years now. At the end, garment workers just want a decent, safe, and properly paid job like everyone else, no matter what century they live in. If you consider that the pandemic has happened in our lifetime and how detrimental impact the decisions taken by brands during this time had on the garment workers' lives, you can see that we, the people living today, and our choices do count. We are actually writing history. Are you in for making a better future than our history was? You might think that the salary and circumstances of some faraway factory workers do not depend on you. But here are some things that average people like us customers can do. Choose to wear clothes from brands that do not exploit their workers. There are a lot of sustainable brands that are transparent about their practices. For example, here. Talk to people about the negative effects of fast fashion. Take part in activism for the well-being of the garment workers. We've included some more information about the movements aiming to solve the situation and some options for you to join. Be sure to check them out in the video notes. Thank you for watching and getting